Hi everyone, I'm Max, a research fellow at UNU Macau. Today, we are very glad to have Angela Kane with us. With nearly 4 decades of experience at the United Nations, Ms. Kane has served at many key positions, including Under Secretary General. As a well-known expert in international relations, she is now teaching at Sciences Po and Tsinghua University. She also serves as a senior fellow at Vienna Center for Disarmament and Non-Proliferation, and also a vice president at the International Institute for Peace. We are very glad to have her today. So, Ms. Kane, you have had an extraordinary 37 years career at the United Nations, right? And in your perspective, what have changed during these past years and what haven't? And also, what kind of change would you expect to see in the future?
Thank you, Max, and thank you very much for having me here. As you know, I was for 6 years a member of the Council of the United Nations University, and it's always been a great pleasure to see how the various institutes of the UNU grow and prosper. So I'm very happy to support that and see it here in person in Macau. 37 years is a long time to have been at the United Nations, and I understand it's nearly half of the time that the UN has been in existence. So it gives me a long trajectory of actually where it has gone. And let me tell you that right now it's a very difficult time for the United Nations. It's not the first time that it's a difficult time, because we've been through previous times. I mean, sometimes I was working at the UN, I didn't even want to say I was working at the UN because everyone was really saying what a terrible organization it was. We had a very major spat, if I can call it that, or difference of opinion with the United States at one time. There was a Senator Helms, and he was basically saying, let's do away with the United Nations and their utopian visions. No one talks about that anymore. Now we're thinking that with the current US administration, it's all new. Well, it isn't. And what I'm hoping is that we will live through the end of this one as well. I think it's very difficult because right now it is not only opposition or non-recognition of the United Nations from the part of the United States, but it also is aggravated by the fact that the Security Council is totally divided between, let's say, Russia and other powers because of the Russian invasion into Ukraine, and the tensions that have arisen geopolitically because the United States is no longer the unilateral power, but there's now a multilateral broker, or maybe a bilateral, with US and China being at par with each other in terms of the power that they have. And that creates additional tensions that the United Nations, of course, is reflecting in their divisions, in their discussions, in the deliberations. And I don't know exactly how long this is going to take, but I think that for the next couple of years, we can be certain that it will be continuing to be a very difficult situation that is aggravated by the fact that the United States has a big backlog in their funding. And the funding, of course, is an international obligation, both for the regular budget and the peacekeeping operations. And simply, I believe now the United States is over $3 billion in arrears, and that affects the day-to-day management of the United Nations. It's a very difficult situation for the Secretary General, and it is not easy to look for a solution that will be found very soon.
At UNU Macau, our focus is on how digital technologies intersect with sustainable development. And you've written extensively on how the AI has impact on the sustainable development, right? And so we wonder, like, with the technologies advancing so rapidly today, how do you see AI and other emerging technologies will shaping the future of our SDGs, and especially for the Global South?
That's a very important question, and I think it's really important to address this. And I know that UNU Macau has been at the forefront of this issue since the time it was founded. And it was very visionary of the founders to think about that subject coming up and also to concentrate on it, because technology has developed so quickly that I think now it's even hard to catch up with it, to sort of say, what's new? How can we basically input into the technology, and how can we benefit from the technology? And there are a lot of benefits from the technology. If I just think about health issues, for example, but there's also great fear on the part of people, particularly maybe not young people, but also older people. Will, let's say, a robot replace me, or will AI replace me? And how can we safeguard amongst that? Because what I've seen is that when you think about how technology has developed, and I'm not only talking about technological advancement in AI, but also in industry in earlier times, technology has always determined the level of wealth of countries. And so that for the Global South is a real problem, because the Global South is not as well equipped, is not as well handling and knowledgeable about AI, so they can't necessarily benefit from AI. And that, I think, is something that is unacceptable. You talk about the Sustainable Development Goals. Sustainable Development Goals means that we want to empower the countries who are currently not at the forefront of the development to increase their prosperity, to increase their wealth, to partake in all of the developments that AI has to offer. And that is something that is very difficult. Why? Because AI is not necessarily always in government, but there are so many private industries. I mean, it's primarily the private industries, the companies. They're not there to be beneficial to the developing South. They're there to make profit. So that's not their main concern. So how can you as a government influence that development to make sure it benefits the Global South? And the other problem that I see is that very often AI basically now has agency of developing its own research, of developing its own findings. And that means, where do they develop it? They develop it with data that comes from the north. It doesn't necessarily come from the south. And that's detrimental also to the development of the south, because it doesn't take their existence, their facts, their parameters into account. And that's very much detrimental to their development that they could have. So I think there needs to be a lot of issues that need to be addressed that I find very difficult in addressing. The Secretary General Guterres has been at the forefront of this development, calling for rules. He has a global digital compact, which was developed about a year ago. It was adopted by the Summit for the Future, which was held in September last year. It was appended to the Summit of the Future, meaning the member states didn't necessarily negotiate it, but they felt it was important enough to append it to something that was future leading, or that was future looking into. And so now it's a question of how do we actually implement it. And that, I think, is still very much up in the air. Will governments, will private companies accept let's say, a governance from the United Nations, a governance from member states, which don't necessarily all have the same standing and which not all have the same level of expertise in this matter? And I see that that is going to be a big problem, because I don't think this is going to be so easy, particularly because governments are also reluctant on their own to effect governance rules and regulations. And if you think about it, the EU has taken a lead in it. Some other countries have basically also made some efforts at regulating AI in their own countries, but with grave difficulties. And so the question is, an international governance of AI, I foresee with a big question mark. And now what have you seen also is, because the private companies are clearly recognizing that they need to do something to contribute to this regulation and governance. So you have a lot of voluntary arrangements, voluntary commitments that they're making. I mean, like the Seoul Declaration, for example, of late last year. But these are voluntary. You just don't really know if they're going to be implemented or not. Companies sign up to it and say, yes, 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 we'll do that, which is very much welcomed. But in the end, what they say in English, the proof of the pudding is in the eating, because you don't know, will they actually adhere to it? Who's going to control that? Who's going to monitor it? And who's going to actually call them to account if they haven't implemented it? So that's lot of questions that are arising that I think are going to be very difficult to solve. But I'm very happy that the international community in the United Nations, the Security Council, the General Assembly have paid attention to that issue and actually have, in the Security Council, you had meetings on AI. In the General Assembly, you had resolutions on AI, very recent, last year, but it's a very encouraging sign that there's attention paid to it.
Well, that links to our next questions, because as we know, in 1995, you have launched the UN's website, and also you have led the UN Internet Technology Board for so many years. So do you think there's some common experience between how we are going to regulate the internet and also how we are going to do with AI?
Max, you hit the point in this question, and I will tell you, why did I do the internet, the website for the UN? And I had taken a job with the Department of Information, and I joined the Department for Information, and I thought it was very exciting because they had a couple of pages, like maybe 8 or 10 pages, that they developed on the web. And they were very proud that they had launched this website for the United Nations. And so after about a month, I said to my boss, the Undersecretary General, I said, when are we having more of this website development? And he said, what do you mean? What do you mean? We have a website. I said, yes, we have a website, but it's like you tune in the same television program every single day. So I said, we need to have more. He said, do you know anything about it? And I said, no, but I'm interested. He said, you own it, you own it. So then all of a sudden he gave me the assignment that I was continuing to develop it. Now, how did you do a website in 1995? You had to code it all by hand. Basically manually code it. It was very labor intensive. But my very large department that I had, not department, but a very large office, had various aspects of various subgroups. One of them was the library. And the library is very good. Librarians are very skilled in organizing content. So I sort of said to the library people, any volunteers? Who would like to learn coding, for a website? And they raised their hands and they were like, wonderful. They learned, they made snowball effects, taught others, etc. So all of a sudden, we had a thriving website and it was like developed. Then member states have said, it's in English only. Where's the other languages? And I said, okay, we'll do it in French as well, because French and English are working languages. And then, of course, there was no money for it. So then we asked also some people maybe to freelance and do the translations. Then, of course, the other languages had to be found. Very difficult. But on the other hand, other offices in the UN also, not only DPI, information, yes, but other offices wanted to also have their own websites. I'm dealing with political affairs. I'm dealing with General Assembly. So they all wanted it. So then came the question, what kind of organization of the site would you have? And that became a big problem because they all wanted to be on the top and not underneath like a subdivision or something. So I started to call a meeting and sort of said, we need to organize this. So we need to agree what's the hierarchy, what's the coordination and what's the hierarchy. And that became very, very complicated. We worked on it for about a year. And when the year was over, the whole site was basically already out of bounds because the technology had gone so quickly, so fast, that it was no longer necessary to have this. So all of a sudden, and that's where I'm thinking of, now the technology that we have now is like a reinvention of the wheel. But the thing is that what we experienced then, basically we have now, that the technology is advancing so fast that by the time that you catch up with the regulation part of it, it's already outdated. So my point is that I think what we should do is to try to phase out or to try to regulate those aspects that are really, really bad, meaning that everyone agrees they should not be. And that's, for example, pornography. That's, for example, deep fakes. You know about in some election campaigns, there would be a person who impersonates the candidate, but then you saw this picture of Pope Francis in a big fluffy coat, etc. So those are clearly fakes, and fake information is really very dangerous because it tilts people's impression of what's happening in the world because they don't know any other forms of information or any other forms of media, but they follow false information media. And that's very dangerous. So if you can regulate that at least, and then think about how else it's going to happen. But that's why I find it very difficult to talk about international regulation of the whole AI governance. I find this not very likely, and I think there'll be a lot of opposition to that. And that is already becoming apparent despite the Global Digital Compact. So you can address certain parts of it, but not all of them. And coming to this ITU forum, which is basically bringing together all the IT parts of the entire UN system. So it's very powerful. And I chaired that for quite some time. And it was like herding cats, to be honest with you. It was very, very difficult because everyone felt they had the best answer and they had the best solutions. And they didn't necessarily want to share these solutions, even though the whole forum, the whole committee was there to share solutions, to say we've had good experience with X and you should actually do this as well. I mean, not the social media side, but we're, with this product, and you should also use that product. Even come to, we had these big discussions at the time. The United Nations and other agencies of the UN employ interpreters and translators. Interpreters more difficult, but translators, I basically said, let's get the experiences together about what translation software or app, whatever, is useful, for you, what can be used. So, you share experiences, and that's actually very helpful. And then maybe as the next step, if you've shared experience and you agree you're going to buy product such and such, then maybe you can make a purchase for everyone, which makes it cheaper. So you can bargain to get a cheaper product. So those are actually very important aspects. And I'm glad that this is still being pursued because there's a scale issue. If you scale it up, you can get it cheaper, which is good for the United Nations as well, and for the member states, which essentially are paying for it. But when it comes to regulating AI, the governance of AI, I think this is going to be a long, long program if we can ever solve it. And I have not great hopes that we can solve it, but we can solve certain aspects of it. And that's already something that I would find on an international context encouraging, because we need a success story right now. We really badly need it.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And also the next question. At UNU Macau, we organize annual AI conference to convene global stakeholders. And this year's conference is set on October 23rd to 24th, the UN Day. The conference is theming on AI for humanity, building an equitable digital future. So what do you think we can maximize the impact of such gatherings, like to have meaningful progress?
I think meaningful progress is very much needed. And I'm very glad that UNU Macau is organizing this conference. It's not only to bring researchers together, to explore solutions together, maybe to present papers, to present panel discussions, but it is also important to continue follow up on this. What was coming out of this conference? What did people think about this? And what is good about technology in particular is because now we have so many different means of communicating. It isn't only in person. I mean, think about, 30, 50 years ago, it was only in person, which made it very difficult, made it very expensive. I'm not saying that flying is that much cheaper these days, but on the other hand, what is important is that you make certain connections in person, and it's always good to follow up on these connections later on, that you sort of say, well, you're continuing to work on a solution. I'd like to collaborate with you, or I'd like to hear more about the research that you're doing, how you're propagating it, and also how is it shared. And I think the sharing of ideas, the sharing of solutions, and bringing it to the people who actually are in need of those solutions, that's something that I find very meaningful. And I'm hoping that it is also being sufficiently supported financially, because the countries from the South very often don't have the means, to come to Macau, to come to locations which are far from their home country. But it is very important that you connect people, and the connecting tissue can be very, very strong. And that's what I hope to see, that the solutions get embedded in the future work program, not only at the UNU Macau, but also in the countries where the researchers come from, and that the research which is being conducted also has solutions that they offer. You know, it's not only that you know the research and where the problems are, but then the question is always, what can I do about these problems? And I think that here now with AI, there are solutions available. I mean, if you think about some issues, you can say, I want to do research, and you can plug it into ChatGPT or Copilot or something and sort of say, give me some ideas. And, you know, the AI cannot solve everything, and we know that. But the AI can give you some ideas that you can build on and that you can develop. And I think that that is really important. And to have these meetings with people makes it much more meaningful for the follow-up. Because if you just have it, you know, on a Zoom or on another platform, MS Teams or something, it isn't always as sustainable. And I have noticed that myself, because during the COVID period, we had constantly these Zooms, and I get very tired of only having Zooms. I want to see people. I want to see you smile in person. I want to see you ask questions in person, not always on Zoom. Zoom or MS Teams, you know, that's a platform that is useful and we must use it, but not exclusively.
Thank you. And also one last question for the younger generation, because as a professor at Singapore and Tsinghua University, you always had first-hand interactions with the younger generation, right? So considering like the uncertainty nowadays, what advice do you have for them? And how can we support them?
I think what advice I have is basically to be more optimistic. I think a lot of the young people are very pessimistic these days. I've noticed this more and more in the last 2-3 years. And I think COVID had a lot to do with it, because people were isolated. They were home alone, I mean, with their families or their partners or whatever. So they felt they didn't have this meaningful exchange that I was just talking about, an interpersonal exchange. And that also affected, of course, the economic situation. You know, countries are not doing as well as they used to. Everyone was always focused on growth, growth. We need to grow. Well, maybe we should kind of take it a step back and say, maybe growth is not all that good. Maybe we should stay at this level. We need to make sacrifices because of the environment deteriorating, because of the natural disasters that we have. We have some biological issues that are coming up that are very difficult. So I'm not surprised that younger people are not as hopeful looking out into the future as people of my generation. I mean, my generation was like, the world was open. The world was your oyster. You know, you came somewhere and people were looking to hire you. That is no longer the case. And I realized that. And I think one of the ways of helping young people is also to be honest about this, to say, look, this is the situation. We need to make the best that we can of it. But, you know, the expectation that you had of like making a lot of money, you know, adjust your vision a little bit, talk to others. Where do you want to go? And happiness is not necessarily to have a pot of gold, but also happiness lies in your own environment and your family, in taking pleasure in the little parts, you know, to see a little bird somewhere chirping. You know, it's like, it sounds stupid, but it isn't. It's something to focus on, not only what is necessary for you personally, but also have to make time for a little bit of the other issues in your life that are important. But it is worrisome because people worry about, if I don't have a job, you know, can I afford a family? Can I afford living somewhere? Can I afford this? Can I do that? Can I take care of my parents later on in life? So I understand that the worry is very clearly there. But there's an advantage also, and that is like, you can now travel a lot. You know, you didn't used to be travel when you had steamships going. You know, it took a long time and you had to have a contract. Now you can sort of say, okay, fine, let me try something else. Maybe I can go somewhere. And there are jobs, but sometimes it isn't always the highest paying jobs, but maybe it's a little bit of a lever one, but it gives you satisfaction because you enjoy the work that you're doing. And that's something that I think is also important. Everyone wants to have a big career. And yes, I understand that. And, you know, clearly in many senses, I had that too. But on the other hand, when you get older, you also learn that that's not the most important thing in life. There are other aspects that are really important and that you need to pay attention to. But we must be honest. We are going into, or we are already in a situation where you have economic difficulties, where you have difficult weather conditions, climate change conditions, and you have strong geopolitical tensions between the major states that make it very, very difficult to basically look into a rosy future. That is not the case right now.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Max, for having me.